Hi there, my name is Cherie. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Cape Town and I'm specializing in applied paleoecology and I'm excited to share this research with you today. The title of the talk is Using Palaeoecology and Participatory System Dynamics to Inform Conservation of a Biodiversity-Rich but Endangered Ecosystem. So the research paper I'll be presenting today actually is one of the chapters in my thesis, and the broad research conceptual framework that I'm using for my PhD looks at a past, present, future link between ecosystem services and changes that affect ecosystem services such as land use and climate change. Basically, I'm using mixed methods which include paleoecology to tell us about the past and how things have changed in the past, stakeholder engagement which gives us an understanding of why the system changes, and then system dynamics modeling as a way to understand how and why the system might change in the future. So let's orientate ourselves geographically. The case study I'll be presenting today, known as Elandsberg Private Nature Reserve, is found within the Cape Floristic Region, and this is one of the 25 biodiversity hotspots in the world. It is such a special place because it has over 9,000 plant species, of which 68% of them are only found in this region. The problem is that 30% of the vegetation within the Cape Floristic region has been lost, and out of all the vegetation types that occur here, West Coast renosterwald has been impacted the most, with more than 90% of it being transformed, mostly due to agriculture. And this is mostly because this type of renosterwald vegetation occurs within the lowlands where it's easily accessible and there are fertile soils which are ideal for agriculture. So it means that the remaining fragments have an irreplaceable conservation value. So what is renosterwald? Well, it's classified as an evergreen, fire-prone shrubland. It usually has an understory of grasses and it has a huge diversity of bulbs. But the most dominant species is this really dull shrub, which is very unpalatable. Nothing likes to eat it besides maybe a rhinoceros, and it's called renosterbos. This is the most dominant species. So the aim of the research paper is to provide a proof of concept for using the mixed methods that I mentioned as a way to investigate plant biodiversity and how it changes in response to drivers of change, with the hope of informing policy and management. So let's articulate the problem in terms of the case study. So Elandsberg Private Nature Reserve has one of the largest areas of pristine and intact renosterwald in the region. It was originally declared a nature reserve in 1973, and that was for the protection of the geometric tortoise, which is also only found in this region. Later on, large indigenous herbivores were reintroduced into the area because they had been displaced a few hundreds of years ago. And it has this huge diversity in plant species. But despite the amazing conservation and ecotourism practices that they have at the nature reserve, there are still management uncertainties. And this is largely due to the poor understanding of renosterwald history because so much of it has been transformed. So I know that with system dynamics modeling, we very seldom go back 50 years in time, but let's do that in this example. So if you look at the paleo data just 50 years back from when the sediment core was retrieved, which was in 2012, that gets us to the 1960s. But there are various hypotheses of what fire, grazing, and biodiversity looked like. So for example, with fire, we could think that the recent spike that we see in the charcoal is actually recovery. And this is probably because, renosterwald is a fire-prone vegetation type. It needs fire to reproduce. And also because there was fire suppression during the settler agricultural period. But actually, what we see is that fire was a lot lower in this particular site than it is today. Then if we think of grazing, we might think that we see another recovery in the recent changes. And this is because we know that herbivores were recently displaced between the 1700s and 1900s, and now they are recovering. But actually what we find is that in more recent years, there is a lot more grazing than there was previously. And then there is this huge debate about what the original compositional state of Renosterwald should look like. Some say it's a shrubby grassland, others say it's a grassy shrubland, but there has been this consensus that there was a lot more grass in the area. But actually what you'll see is that there wasn't a lot of grass, and the grass is a lot lower than we expected it to be, and it's probably more of a grassy shrubland. So that means that this might be an inappropriate management target. In other words, we need to burn more, have more grass, and have more game farming. Another thing I want to point out is that statistically there was a regime shift which occurred around the 1950s, and this was due to agricultural intensification, probably because of the increase in grazing. And what was interesting is that even though the nature reserve was declared in the 1970s, you can see that these trends are just exacerbated. So this leads to the problem statement: how to increase or maintain plant biodiversity and therefore improve ecosystem function and resilience for sustainable biodiversity conservation and ecotourism at this particular site. We can also think about the causal relationships. So, for example, we know that there was some grazing, there was some fire, and there was a landscape that was probably a patch mosaic landscape and was dominated by Asteraceae shrubs. But then what we start to see is an increase in grazing, and this was probably due to agriculture. And then after a few more years, agriculture started to intensify, and then we see this increase in an unpalatable shrub known as Renosterwald. So we see a shift in loop dominance occurring here. And then later on, large indigenous herbivores were reintroduced at the site. We start to see even more Renosterwald homogenization. And then with inappropriate land use management, which increased fires, as well as potentially climate change, hotter and drier climates, we see that the success of Renosterwald just increases over time. And in the end, we see a landscape that has these huge patches of unpalatable Renosterwald. And this can be described by the system's archetype success to the successful, or if you think of it in ecological terms, it's known as competitive exclusion principle. Okay, so just to let you know, the paleo data was used in various points of the model development, and I used various calculus techniques applied to the paleo data to determine decision rules in the model. The paleo data was also used as reference modes in the model, as well as identifying a more appropriate baseline that we could test during model analysis, which would be increasing the Asteraceae shrubs and decreasing the unpalatable Renosterwald, as well as decreasing grazing and fire. And then we also used stakeholder inputs to provide model validation and to give us some ideas of what we could use for model analysis. This is one of my most favorite parts of the project, was being able to engage with multiple stakeholders, farmers, conservation practitioners, as well as government officials that are representative of the land management sector. And in this workshop, we were able to capture mental models as a way to gain knowledge about the system and then convert these into explicit knowledge such as causal loop diagrams. So some of the insights that came out of the workshop in terms of mental models, they really value biodiversity, and they see it as an asset that will make the landscape a lot more resilient, and there are also social economic benefits. However, with fire, they mentioned quite a few systemic issues, such as not having enough awareness raising with regards to the importance of fire and how it can be managed, as well as not enough training for controlling and preventing fires, as well as not having enough monitoring of what the impacts of fires are on biodiversity. And then with regards to grazing or herbivory, it was really interesting to hear some of the stakeholders mention that they believe fire is much more of a bigger driver than grazing, which is in contradiction to what we see in the paleo data at the site. And this interesting shift of an increase in game farming in the region, but not for conservation purposes, actually for economic reasons. So this is just a snapshot of the simulation model structure. Basically, I am looking at two stocks which include the Asteraceous shrub pollen and the Rhinoceros pollen, and how drivers of change influence these stocks, which is fire and grazing. So to summarize, there are about 78 variables. Well, there are 78 variables in this model, not a very big model. 4 stocks, 9 flows, and 65 converters. And the simulation period is from using the Paleo time period, so 750 AD, and then 80 years into the future. So obviously, managers are not able to control climate change and the impacts of that, but what they can control are the levels of fire and grazing. So these are the decision points in the model. Now let's look at some of the results. So if managers decide to do nothing, business as usual, this is the base case, we'll see that there'll be a decrease in biodiversity by looking at the decrease in Asteraceous shrubs and an increase in Rhinoceros, and fire will stay at the relatively high levels that it is today. And then also with climate change, like I said before, this is something that is inevitable because there are predictions for this region that it will get a lot hotter and drier, and this will basically influence the increase in fire. So the rest of the simulation scenarios were run with climate change in place. Okay, so if managers decide to control and prevent fire only, what they'll see is that obviously they decrease fire, and this helps with improving biodiversity slightly. However, Rhinoceros is still quite high. Now, if managers decide to decrease grazing only, possibly to the pre-1950s levels, so before agricultural intensification increased grazing so much, what we'll see here is that there will be a slight increase in Asteraceous shrubs and a decrease in Rhinoceros, which is what we want. But what will happen if they used adaptive grazing fire management? So in these scenarios, they could adjust grazing for a certain period of time and then decrease fire. And what we see here is that there is an improvement in biodiversity, but there's still an increase in Rhinoceros, which is very interesting. So what we can recommend for conservation is to implement adaptive grazing fire management by decreasing grazing and fire to maintain the current patch mosaic landscape. So they might not necessarily be able to reverse it to a pre-1950s level, but they can maintain it to a level that is recommended for Asteraceous to Rhinoceros pollen of 0.2 to 0.35 ratio. And this is obviously not as great as the first regime, which is the pre-1950s, and it is a little bit lower than the average that we see in the regime 2, but it is higher, or could be higher than what it currently is when the core was retrieved. Further recommendations. So we know that the regime that we see ourselves in today is a relic of agricultural intensification, and there's very little that the current conservation managers can do because it is difficult to reduce the amount of Rhinoceros just by decreasing fire and grazing. So what can be done is active restoration of certain vegetation units, for example the Asteraceous shrubs and grasses and thickets, and then manual clearing of this unpalatable Rhinoceros shrub. And then to end off with next steps, so another really exciting part of this project is to share the results. And although this paleo diagram is really exciting, it can also be extremely daunting, because how do you even interpret these results? And what does this mean for me if I'm a land use manager? How do I control biodiversity, fire, and grazing? So what I would like to do is have another stakeholder workshop where the stakeholders get an opportunity to actually play with the model. And this is a lot more of a user-friendly format in order for us to generate discussions and also to plan when it comes to land use management. In conclusion, I hope that this presentation has shown that Elandsberg Private Nature Reserve is a good case study for a proof of concept and also looking at how ecosystem services have changed over time and to increase our understanding in order to have more effective management of this ecosystem. Thank you so much.